The doors have opened and everyone can come in. So welcome to the first workshop of UCGIS Week, the Perilous Risk Assessments, Evidence from the National Flood Insurance Program by Joe Vail. And we'll utilize the next hour to sort of learn about this. And Joe was kind enough to send a recording ahead of time of everything, so we'll be able to go through. And as we're going through this workshop, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A session, and Joe will be able to answer them at any point. And we'll also then take all questions and respond to all questions at the end of the session. So Joe, thank you for doing this. And before we get started, I'll say Joe is a PhD candidate at UC Davis working on economics, working on the economics of environmental inequalities. His research leverages microeconomic tools and causal inference methods to study how environmental changes impact the most vulnerable populations and the distributed impacts of public policies that aim to increase environmental resilience. Current projects investigate the unequal adaptation to flood risk in the United States and the distributed impacts of the flood insurance program, as well as the economic origins of inequalities and air pollution exposure. Prior to his doctoral studies, Joe worked as a consultant at the World Bank's Environment and Natural Resource Division. He holds a master's in environmental sciences and engineering from Agro-Paris Tech in France. So Joe, thank you for being a part of UCGIS Week. Welcome all attendees, and we'll go ahead and get this workshop started. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Amy. Hi everyone, and thank you for checking in on this presentation. My name is Joachim Veil. I'm a PhD candidate in environmental economics at UC Davis. Today I'll be talking about my work on flood insurance and flood maps. This is very much work in progress, and so if you have any thoughts, comments, or feedback, please feel free to contact me at this email address. I'd love to hear what you think. Yes, so in the United States, floods are among the costliest natural disasters, and they create economic damages of several $billion per year on average. It's also expected to become much worse and much more frequent, both due to sea level rise on the coast, but also due to intense local precipitations that can happen anywhere inland. For instance, here, this is a picture from the flooding that occurred last year in flooding of the Arkansas River in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And this is very much not a wealthy community located on the coast. It's a relatively disadvantaged community located inland. And they are also going to be exposed to more frequent and damaging flooding. So today, there are already trillions of dollars of properties that are at risk of flooding in the United States. And to cover these risks, you can purchase insurance. And in the US, about 95% of flood insurance policies are provided by the National Flood Insurance Program. It's a federal program that insures about 5.5 million properties nationwide. However, this number is thought to be very, very low, and that there could be 3 times as many properties that are exposed to high risk of flooding. And so only a fraction of properties that are at risk of flooding in the United States actually carry flood insurance. This was already the case when Hurricane Katrina hit about 10 years ago, and this is still very much the case today. And this is a bit of a puzzle because flood insurance is relatively subsidized. So the federal government provides insurance for a lower cost than what it actually costs if it floods. And there is also an insurance mandate in place if your property is located in the 100-year floodplain of the FEMA flood maps. And I'm going to spend a lot of time during this presentation really describing what are these flood maps and how they work. But basically they show different zones. And if you're located inside the 100-year zone, where the risk of flooding exceeds 1% per year, then if you have a mortgage on your house, you're required by law to purchase flood insurance. And despite that, there is low flood insurance take-up, but also the number of flood insurance policies that are active has been declining a lot this past decade. So this is the UCGIS week. So here is the first map, and I'm going to show many of them. So this is the map for Sacramento County. And here you can see the different flood zones. So the light blue is the 100-year floodplain. If you're located anywhere in this light blue area, the chance of flooding exceeds 1% per year, and you're required by law to purchase flood insurance for your house if you have a mortgage on your house. And there are also urban planning constraints that come with it, other requirements that I will go through. The 500-year floodplain here in orange, in this zone, the flood risk is estimated to be only 0.2% per year. So it's a lower risk than the blue zone. And so yeah, I'm using these colors, quick parenthesis, I'm using these colors, blue and orange, because these are the official colors used by FEMA. But if you have strong thoughts about these color schemes or better suggestions, I'd love to hear them. And there are also different zones that can be highlighted on these maps. For instance, in pink here, this is outside of the floodplain due to levees that are constructed. And so in this pink area, you do not need, you're not required to purchase flood insurance. But if you want, you can. So these flood maps do a lot of things. And first, they are used to set flood insurance premiums. If you're located in the blue zone here, the high risk zone, your flood insurance premium, the price of your flood insurance, is going to be much higher than if you're located outside of it in the gray area, or in a lower risk zone, such as orange here or pink here. And this, the price of flood insurance can vary a lot. It can be anywhere from about $200–300 per year to more than $1,000 per year. In the US, it's about, the average price for flood insurance is about $700 per year. As I mentioned, if you're located in the light blue area, the 100-year floodplain, you're required to purchase flood insurance if you have a mortgage on your house. And these flood maps are also used to convey flood risk information to homeowners and renters. Finally, mayors and city planners use these flood maps because they can impose some construction requirements or limit constructions in certain areas, in particular in the 100-year floodplain. So what's very clear is that city planners and homeowners alike don't really like being zoned inside the 100-year floodplain, because that means that they have to purchase insurance, and their flood insurance premium is going to be higher. They are going to have to pay more to insure their property. So these maps are heavily criticized. They are heavily criticized for being outdated. And in fact, there is a report that found that almost 50% of all maps were more than 10 years old, even though they are supposed to be updated every 5 years. And they're also criticized because they can be subject to manipulation. And this comes from the fact that it's pretty hard to estimate flood risk. And as I just mentioned, there can be pretty strong incentives to reduce the stated risk on the flood map, because this can reduce the price of flood insurance and relax some of the urban planning constraints. However, since the Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005, there has been huge investments to improve these maps, and in particular to digitize all the paper-based flood maps. And the goal of this updating was really to improve flood risk assessments, to improve information access, and to improve insurance take-up, because already at the time of Hurricane Katrina, very few people carried the flood insurance, and it was thought that getting these maps could improve take-up and coverage by flood insurance. Here I'm showing what this program did to the city of Davis, where I live, for instance. On the left, you have the old map that came into effect in 1979. And you see the 100-year floodplain here in dark gray, the 500-year floodplain in light gray on the side. And to the right here, I'm showing the same area, but after the flood map update, which occurred for Davis in 2010. And you can see the 100-year floodplain in blue and the 500-year floodplain in orange. And it's also much easier to access this information today than it was with the previous map, because here, so this is an online platform where you can just type in your address on the search bar, and it will show you exactly where your home is. And so you can figure out very quickly and easily if you're located in the 100-year floodplain or outside of the 100-year floodplain, where flood insurance might be recommended, but not mandatory. And again, despite this, there's more than 50% of all current flood maps that are considered outdated. And this raises concerns that this may limit flood insurance take-up. However, updating all the flood maps would cost between $4.5 and $7.5 billion. It's really, really expensive. And producing these flood maps in the first place is one of the most expensive cartography efforts ever. So so that was a fairly long introduction, but the research question that I'm going to be asking is whether the modernization of flood maps can increase flood insurance take-up rates in the United States. A quick preview of the finding. I find that it really could improve flood insurance take-up, but so far in aggregate it hasn't. And it hasn't mostly because the new flood maps tend to rezone people outside of the 100-year floodplain where flood insurance is mandatory. And in fact, since 2005, I find that there are at least 3 million people that were rezoned outside of the 100-year floodplain to a lower risk rating. And I estimate that in aggregate, the digitization of flood maps led to a decline in flood insurance coverage of at least 100,000 policies, which is really an unintended consequences of this flood map modernization program, because one of the goals was, again, to improve flood insurance take-up. Okay, so I'm using several sources of GIS data. First, I used a digitized version of the FEMA flood maps that were effective in 2005. And I also use the current and archived FEMA flood maps that were updated since 2010. And putting these two together really allows me to identify what changes occurred in the extent of the 100-year and 500-year floodplains by comparing these spatial polygons. Then it's one thing to compare these polygons, but a lot of these like high flood risk areas could be areas where no one lives. And if that's the case, we don't really care about rezoning in these areas. So to make sure or to figure out exactly what rezoning occurred where people live, I also use a population layer for the United States. And for that, I use the EnviroAtlas Dasymetric allocation of population. So dasymetric allocation just means that it basically takes the population estimates from the Census Bureau that are computed at the census tract level. And then it uses footprints of buildings to reallocate population within a census tract, so that we don't assume that population is homogeneously allocated within the census tract, but instead is allocated where there are like buildings and other human infrastructures. So here I'm showing a bit the timing and where this digitization occurred. So on the left, I'm showing time on the x-axis and the number of census tracts in the United States that got an updated digital flood map. And you can see that between 2010 and 2019, there are more than 25,000 census tracts that got access to their first digital flood map. I just received more data from FEMA through a Freedom of Information Act to be able to also look at what happened before 2010. And hopefully I'll be able to include that pretty soon. On the right, I'm showing where these digital flood maps came into effect in the US. And you can see that there's a pretty good representation, and all states got some digital flood maps, some updated flood maps since 2005. So there are almost 50,000 census tracts that now have a digital flood map. But again, as I mentioned, this is a process that is dynamic because flood risk is changing, and communities can build infrastructures to reduce their flood risk as well. And so flood maps are supposed to be updated at least every 5 years. And there are still a lot of places that don't have a digital flood map. Okay, so what did the digitization do? And so here I'm going to show a bunch of maps from different places in the US. And here we can first look at Eastern Broward County in Florida. On the left, that was the flood map that was into effect in 2005, before the digitization. So this is a digital version of the paper-based flood map on the left. In blue is the 100-year floodplain. And on the right, that's the new digital flood map that came into effect in 2014. And you can see that a lot of the rezoning occurred. A lot of places were rezoned outside of the 100-year floodplain, so from blue to orange, which means a reduction in flood risk. And again, this occurs at a time where we think that flood risk is overall increasing in most places due to climate change. So that's just for Broward County in Florida. If you look at the city of New Orleans in Louisiana, you see a very similar picture. So again, on the left, you have the flood map, that the paper-based flood map, and you can see that a lot of the areas in the city of New Orleans were characterized as fairly high risk in blue. And in 2016, the new maps came into effect, and these new maps show an overall reduction in flood risk, with a lot of blue areas that become either orange, so from 100-year flood zone to 500-year flood zone, so reduction in risk, but also pink, which means really outside of the floodplain because of levees. And again, it can make sense in the case of New Orleans, because this city invested a lot in drainage system to reduce flood risk. But still, that's overall a massive reduction in stated flood risk for most of the city. And again, this flood risk is going to benefit a lot homeowners because that reduces a lot the price that they pay for flood insurance if they decide to carry it. But on the other hand, they may stop buying flood insurance just because if they are not in the 100-year floodplain, flood insurance is not mandatory. And this is what we are going to be looking at in a little bit. I couldn't resist showing a few more pictures from for California. So this is the change in the floodplain in the flood map, in the FEMA flood maps for Sacramento County between 2005 and today. What's interesting with these maps is that you can see that the polygons didn't really change, but the colors changed, weirdly enough. This means that the underlying polygons that showed the different flood zones were not modified, but a lot of places were just reclassified as being lower risk than they were before. So, well, this is true almost everywhere. This is not true in this area. In this area, you have moved from orange to blue, so an increase in flood risk. But this is also an area where not a lot of people live. But for downtown Sacramento, you see that a lot of the blue, the 100-year floodplain was rezoned as outside of the floodplain due to levees. And overall, you see same a massive reduction in the 100-year flood zone. One area where we see the opposite picture occurring is in Collier County on the west side of Florida. All this area here was previously classified as the 500-year floodplain, but in the new flood maps, a lot of these areas are classified as 100-year floodplain, so an increase in risk. However, there's also like an increase in the complexity of these maps, as you can see on like all the previous examples, and a lot of places are almost gerrymandered here as being outside of the 100-year floodplain or even the 500-year floodplain, so just in gray. And this kind of what I call climatic gerrymandering, that can make sense for several reasons. And in particular, if you have the placement of fields that elevate where people are going to be building their homes and reduce the flood risk there. But that can also happen because now city planners, the Corps of Engineers and FEMA are using better models to predict flood risk. And so you could have finer estimation of flood risk at different points in place. Okay, so putting what happened in the United States together, on these maps, I'm showing in blue places that showed an overall increase in the number of people located in the 100-year floodplain. And so this is using both the change in the polygons of the flood maps, but also the daisy-matrix allocation of population. And you can see that in Louisiana here, on Western Florida here, you have more people that are classified as being in the 100-year floodplain. But there is also in red a lot of areas where census tracts where on average people tended to be classified as outside of the 100-year floodplain. So you have in particular here in Eastern Florida, but also in a few places in California. And if you look on aggregate at the state level, Florida and California tended to really remove people from the 100-year floodplain. And so to reclassify a lot of properties as being lower flood risk than they were previously. And these numbers can be large. So like 1.5 million for Florida, almost 1 million people classified as outside of the 100-year floodplain for California. And the states that increased the number of people as classified in the 100-year floodplain tended to not add that many people to the 100-year floodplain. So we are talking 20, 30,000 people here for Massachusetts and Mississippi. So now the question that I'm asking is, okay, we have this big changes in the flood maps that occurred since 2005. These changes tended to rezone people as living outside, showing that they were now outside of the 100-year floodplain. The question is, what did this do to flood insurance take-up? Did this lead to increase in flood insurance take-up or decreases? And both things could happen, and in particular, we could expect to see an increase in flood insurance take-up due to a price effect, because now if you're located outside of the 100-year floodplain, this implies a decrease in the price of the flood insurance, a decline in the policy premium. So it's now cheaper to purchase flood insurance, so that could lead you to want to buy more of it. But on the other hand, this could lead people to drop the flood insurance that they were previously buying, because first, if they are rezoned outside of the 100-year floodplain, they can think that due to an information effect, they can think that they are at lower risk of flooding. But also, they are not subject to the flood insurance mandate requirement anymore if they are outside of the 100-year floodplain. So just because of that, they may stop buying flood insurance. Okay, so to get at that, we are going to go through tiny and healthy amounts of econometrics to look at the impact of rezoning on the demand for flood insurance. To look at that, I'm using data on all flood insurance policies that were active between 2010 and 2020. And I aggregate, so this is about 50 million observations on flood insurance. And I aggregate all this data at the census tract level. In other work, I'm conducting the similar analysis where I try to match each individual insurance policy to a property that is geolocalized, but there are matching issues, and I can only do this analysis for a few states, and so I'm not showing these results today. But so we want to study what's the impact of the new flood map that come into effect on flood insurance take-up. And so the very standard way to answer this question would be to do a regression of the number of policies that are active in census tract I and month T. And we want to regress that on the treatment, the policy treatment, which is having a new digital flood map. And so this is a dummy variable that will switch on to 1 when the census tract receives a new flood map. Because we think that people are likely to respond differently if they are rezoned towards the 100-year floodplain or outside of the 100-year floodplain, or maybe not likely to respond at all if there is no change. I'm also interacting this variable here by a variable that will keep track of just that, whether there was rezoning towards the 100-year floodplain or outside of the 100-year floodplain for the population that's living in this census tract. Now, census tracts are very different from one another. And so I'm also including dummy variables in this regression. So 1 dummy variable for each census tract. And this is going to basically soak up unobserved variation that is fixed through time at the census tract level. And I'm also adding month dummy variables here, eta t. And this is because we know that there are other things that can drive flood insurance demand in the United States, and in particular, flooding events have been shown to really increase the demand for flood insurance. And so here I'm adding these monthly dummies just to keep track of that and to control for these events that could also lead to increased flood insurance take-up. When you estimate that, these are the coefficients you get. So first, you see that overall, so I'm doing the regression in logs, so you can interpret these coefficients as percent changes. And you can see that overall the effect of a digital flood map is an increase of about 6% on the number of flood insurance policies in force in the census tract. But this effect is really seems to be really different depending on whether this is a census tract where the flood map tended to reason people as outside of the 100-year floodplain, in which case we observe a decline of 25% in the number of policies that are active. Whereas on the contrary, if the flood map tended to reason people toward the 100-year floodplain, we see an increase of about 15% of the number of people, of the number of flood insurance policies in force. So this is the standard way to look at the impact of rezoning on flood insurance demand. But recently there has been a lot of literature showing that estimating these kind of what we call a two-way fixed effect models can be a really bad way to get at the treatment effect or at the impact of a policy if you have heterogeneity in the impact of the policy. And this can be heterogeneity both between census tracts, but also what we call dynamic heterogeneity, if people tend to respond in a dynamic fashion to the policy. There are all these papers that are highlighting slightly different issues with these two-way fixed effect models. And they provide alternative estimation methods that allow you to get a consistent and robust average treatment effect of the policy, and in our case, flood map updates, if that's what you're concerned with. However, in this case, the average treatment effect is really not what we are most interested in. I'm not especially interested in knowing how this digital flood map changed flood insurance demand on average across all the United States. What I really want to know is where the digital flood maps increase the demand for flood insurance and where they decrease the demand for flood insurance. And answering this question is much, much harder. But it's also a lot more interesting because then we can start to look at, okay, what are the communities that saw the biggest declines in flood insurance demand? Why did this occur? And where do we have potentially a resilience issue where we saw where a lot of people dropped flood insurance and are not covered anymore? And so to answer this question, the method that I'm going to be using now is a slightly fancier method called synthetic control. And so synthetic control is a method that is typically used in policy evaluation when you want to estimate the impact of one policy on a single large unit that becomes treated. And large units, think about either states in the US or an entire country. And when you're trying to estimate the impact of a policy on a state or on a country, oftentimes the issue you're running into is that you don't have a lot of control units to compare that to, of units that do not receive the policy and that can serve as control for your policy treatment. And even if you have, in the US, you have several units that could serve, like you have several states that can serve as control, but they may not necessarily be good control because they don't look at the state that will receive the policy. And so for all these reasons, this synthetic control method has been developed to handle that. And so here I'm showing figures from the Abadi et al. 2010 paper that looks at applying the synthetic control approach to estimate the effect of Prop 99 in California. So Prop 99, that was just a policy that put a tax on cigarette sales in California. And we want to know whether this policy decreased or didn't do anything to cigarette sales in the state. And so if you look at cigarette sales in California, you have time in years on the x-axis, and on the y-axis that per capita cigarette sales. The solid line here, that's for the outcome variable, so per capita sales for California. And the dashed line, that's the per capita sales for the other states outside of California. And you see that these two look pretty different. So it wouldn't be quite correct to just compare the two to see if the policy Prop 99 had any impact. But it also looks like you have kind of a break in the slope here for California. And so it seems that there is some kind of effect on the sales of cigarettes in California. And so to get at that, this is exactly what you can use the synthetic control for. And basically, the synthetic control is constructing a weighted average of the states that do not receive the policy, so that in this case, that do not receive the Prop 99 in California. And you construct this weighted average such as to match the evolution of the outcome variable you're interested in prior to the policy treatment. So here, really this, so we still have California as the solid black line, and the dotted line shows the synthetic control that is constructed such as to match the evolution of sales in California prior to the enactment of Prop 99. And you see here that the researchers were able to construct a pretty good synthetic control in that you have a pretty tight fit between the synthetic control and California prior to the policy. And now what's really nice and intuitive is that you can follow how the synthetic control evolves after Prop 99. And again, it's a weighted average of the US states. And so you can weight the relevant sales of cigarettes in these states to look at how this evolves. And compare that to what happened in California. And in California, you see this sharp decline after the passage of, well, probably not an English word, the enactment of Prop 99. So it looks like there was an effect of this policy, and you can measure this treatment effect by taking the vertical difference here between the synthetic California, the synthetic control, and the real outcome variable for California there. And you can also look at the dynamic effects. Okay, so that was a lot on this method. It's a relatively niche method in econometrics and policy evaluation, but it's starting to become more broadly used. And I wanted to flag it because what I'm doing in this paper and going back to the flood maps is taking this method and using it to get at heterogeneity. So really to estimate what are the different impacts of flood maps updates in the United States in different locations. And in that way, I think it's really a policy evaluation tool that we can think about applying more in spatial context. So bringing it to my setting, I'm going to estimate a distinct synthetic control for each of the 12,000 census tracts that receive a digital flood map in this window between 2011 and 2018. So I'm not using all census tracts because I want to make sure that I have enough pre-treatment window to construct synthetic controls that match what I actually observe in the data. And same for the post-treatment window. But again, I want to emphasize that this method is usually used when you only have like one country or one state. Here, I'm using it, I'm estimating a different synthetic control for each individual census tract. So this is a bit what this looks like. And so here you have time on the x-axis in months. On the y-axis, you have the number of policies in force. And each facet here is showing you a different census tract in the US. So if you look at 12, so that's Florida, 22, I think that's Louisiana, the FIPS code, I think it's for Louisiana. I should know by now. And again, you see that I'm constructing this synthetic control as the dashed line, such as to match the number of policies in force prior to the flood map updates in the census tract. And you see that here, I'm doing the procedure I'm using is doing a pretty good job constructing this synthetic control. And this is true in most states. Sometimes there is a bit of a gap, and I'm working on constructing better synthetic controls in these cases. But overall, even like for very different levels of the outcome variable, so even in census tracts that have relatively like very few active insurance policies, like 6, 8 here, or a lot of insurance policies, like more than 3,000 here, almost 1,000 there. I'm doing a pretty good job finding a synthetic control that can match the outcome variable in the census tract. And once you have that, what's nice is that you can just take again the vertical differences between what you actually see in the census tract, the number of policies in force that you observe, and the synthetic control that you constructed here. And that gives you the treatment effect in that census tract. There is a lot of things I'm living under the hood here. In particular, when you're doing that, you see that you don't immediately have confidence intervals. And that's because we are not like to quantify uncertainty about treatment effects. If you want to do that here, you're not relying on what we call the asymptotic theory, but instead there are permutation-based methods that you can use to construct confidence intervals. And all these are details that I'm not going to talk about now, but if you're interested in them, feel free to contact me afterwards, and I'd love to chat more about that. Okay, so again, I estimate these treatment effects at the tract level, and so I have 12,000 of them. And here I'm plotting them depending on whether this is a census tract where the flood map tended to rezone people outside of the 100-year floodplain on the top panel, or whether people were rezoned towards the 100-year floodplain in this flood tract. And so each dot here is an estimated treatment effect. Just to clarify, here, when we run this model, we had like here 3 estimates, one like overall estimates, and then the estimate broken down by whether the census tract reduced 100-year floodplain or increased the 100-year floodplain. In contrast, now we don't have 3, but we have 12,000 estimates. And we see that, again, places that rezoned outside of the 100-year floodplain, especially at high values of the outcome variables, these places tended to see really massive declines in the number of policies in force after 2 years. So on the y-axis here, I'm showing this is the treatment effect estimated 2 years after the policy. In contrast, places that rezoned individuals towards the 100-year floodplain, so showing them as being more at risk of flooding, you see that you tend to have a lot more positive treatment effects, meaning an increase in flood insurance coverage. But there is still some heterogeneity with both positive and negative effects in places that tended to rezone people either towards or outside the 100-year floodplain. Once you have all these census tracts, there are 2 really cool things that you can do. The first one is that here you can aggregate them just by summing them based on what the policy actually did. And if you sum all these census tracts here, all these treatment effects here for census tracts where the flood maps needed to rezone individuals outside of the 100-year floodplain, you find this large negative treatment effect. And so a decline of about more than 100,000 policies overall. And here I'm showing the p-value that I obtained using permutations. On the contrary, census tracts that tended to rezone properties toward the 100-year floodplain, these on aggregate tended to see increases in the number of policies in force, and that's shown by a total treatment effect, so an aggregated treatment effect that is really large and positive. The second cool thing that you can do, and really trying to bring this back to UCGIS week, is that because you have a census treatment effect for each census tract, you can also map them. And here I'm showing them red, again, are the treatment effects that are negative, so declines in the number of policies. And blue are treatment effects that are positive, so increases in the number of policies in force following the flood map update. And you see that there are positive and negative treatment effects a bit everywhere, and each state tends to have both. But you can really zoom in on specific communities. And for instance, if you zoom in on here, Texas and Louisiana, that was recently impacted by Hurricane Laura, you see that there are a lot of places in Texas and in Louisiana in blue here with large dots, so meaning where the flood map updates led to really strong increase in the demand for flood insurance. But you also have other places that seem a bit more concerning, and for instance in Louisiana, that's 2 years, these are the treatment effects estimated 2 years after the new flood map that Louisiana got in 2016. And this is showing that a lot of census tract decreased the people in this census tract in red decreased their demand for flood insurance following the flood map updates. So there was overall a reduction in the number of properties that were covered, that are covered by flood insurance because of the program. Again, these are treatment effects that were estimated, and so these are really causal impacts of the flood map updates on flood insurance demand. Okay, so putting everything together, we started with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, where demand for flood insurance was extremely low. A lot of places that got flooded did not have flood insurance, especially in poor areas. Because of that, a lot of money was put into updating flood maps across the US, and there were hundreds of millions of dollars put into digitizing these flood maps. But we saw that in most cases, these digital flood maps tended to rezone people outside of the 100-year floodplain, so showing them at lower risk than they were previously. So this is the case for Louisiana. And finally, using this generalized approach of synthetic controls estimates, we're able to see that this rezoning of individuals outside of the 100-year floodplain directly led people to decrease their demand for flood insurance and to just stop purchasing flood insurance. So I didn't really emphasize the economics aspect of it, but that's pretty interesting because it shows that even though in all these places that were previously blue and now became orange or pink, the price of flood insurance declined, we saw large declines in demand. So here the law of demand does not really hold. The price drops, but demand also drops. And so this means that people were not responding to the price of insurance when really deciding to make their purchases, but instead more responding to information that is conveyed by these maps. And so here they might think that they are not at risk of flooding anymore because they are not in a 100-year floodplain. But it could also be that they responded to the relaxation of the 100-year mandate and purchase requirements, because outside of the 100-year floodplain, again, these people are not required to purchase flood insurance. So that's all I have for today. I have a lot of ongoing work and preliminary results that I'm not showing yet. In particular, all these flood risk estimates, these are flood risk estimates that are produced by FEMA in partnership with local communities and the Corps of Engineers. But again, there are concerns that some of these estimates of flood risk could be subject to manipulation. And so what I'm doing now is to compare these maps to independent flood risk assessments by Fathom Global and First Street, which is a consortium of researchers and scientists trying to really provide nationwide estimates of flood risk at the parcel level. And instead of doing all this work at the census tract level for the full US, I'm looking into a few specific counties where I can match individual properties using housing transactions to the estimated flood risk and the insurance policies history for that particular property. And this allows me to disentangle a little bit the role of information access versus mortgage requirements. Thank you very much. And again, if you have any thoughts or feedback, please feel free to chat. I think there is an hour where we'll all be logged in to be able to exchange on this. But also, if you want to send me an email, I'd really love to hear what you think. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was wonderful. So, Joe, I'll invite you to come back on, turn on your video, and we can go through and answer some of the questions. I will say I found that absolutely fascinating to sort of look at the history in the past and sort of the work that goes into actually coming up with that. And then, you know, the algorithms that are really helping to explain what's happening between the demand for flood insurance and the people that are actually purchasing those. So I see that we had several questions come through as we were going through that. So that's great. I see that you've answered a few of those live already. So let's take a look at some of those that you wanted to mark as answering live. So here's one from Michael. Do you feel that the new maps are more ground truth, so flood insurance maps, and accurate, or are they manipulated for political or economic reasons?
Right, thanks, Amy. So yeah, Michael, so yeah, this is really an important question. And as I mentioned towards the end, it's really where I'm trying to focus my work right now. But it's also quite a difficult question because the estimation of flood risk is so complicated, and you need really involved models to get an estimate of flood risk. But then you also need more local knowledge of the systems and the drainage that cities put in place to really be able to figure out what is the flood risk at any given location. But on the other hand, you have a trade-off because you have these incentives to map as many people outside of the 100-year floodplain as possible, since being mapped outside of the floodplain reduces by a lot the price of flood insurance. So I didn't show results here, but what I find when I'm using the independent flood risk model developed by Fathom Global and First Street is that there are huge discrepancies in the 100-year floodplain as shown on the FEMA maps and the 100-year floodplain that is shown by this independent consortium of flood scientists. And what is also pretty troubling is that a lot of these discrepancies tend to be bigger in disadvantaged and poorer communities. This is not in itself enough to say that, well, there is clearly political capture and lobbying that screws up the entire mapping process, but it does point to some substantial issues in how these maps are constructed and how we could improve them. And at least one of the reasons that could explain the discrepancy, and it's only one of the reasons, but one of the explanations for this discrepancy between the FEMA product and independent flood risk assessments product is that for a very long time, the FEMA maps did not account for climate change. And they also did not account for flood risk that is due to rain. So it did a good job, more or less, on the coast and estimating flood risk that is due to storm surge and like waves, but not that much in Appalachia, for instance, where you can have a lot of flooding because of rain. These maps did not do a really good job. So yeah, there's more work ongoing, but that's a really important question. So yeah, there was also a couple of questions by Alec regarding the properties market, whether flood zoning had any effect on residential property resales and properties turnover. And again, these are really good questions. And in fact, economists have been asking these questions for a few years. There are like a few papers on the topic, and they tend to not find really strong impacts of these flood maps on either the price of the property or the probability that the property will be sold. This is a bit weird because, again, if you're rezoned inside a 100-year floodplain, you're going to pay a lot more for flood insurance. So this should somehow be capitalized in the price of the home, but that's not what the literature finds. I did a little bit of work on that, focusing on specific areas, and I tend to find, by and large, similar results, that there is no strong impact on property prices. I do find small but significant impact on the probability that the property will be sold, however.
Thanks, Joe. And so I had one sort of specific follow-up, because you had mentioned as part of your follow-up, you're interested in looking at some of the sort of specific counties where you have access to more site-specific data with regards to housing. Are some of those counties sort of scattered across the US? Are some of them in sort of the positive feedback versus the negative feedback on the system, or where sort of what's the distribution of some of those counties that you're looking into?
Yeah, so like to get a little bit into the details, to be able to match the flood insurance policy data to houses, one of the critical piece that you need is the construction year in which the house was built, because this is something that is reported on the insurance policy data. But it's not always reported in the housing transaction data that I use. I'm using the Zillow Z-Tracks data set. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Zillow is making this really big data set available to researchers for free to study all kinds of questions. And with this data set, you can track what properties are being sold, where they are, and they are geolocalized. And so I'm basically doing the matching wherever there's information on the construction dates for these properties. And this tends to be more in Florida than in Louisiana, for instance. But there is some, I can do some matches for the entire US.
Great, thanks. So a couple of other, are there corresponding questions related to seismic hazard estimation?
And there is also a similar question by Michael regarding wildfire risk. So yeah, there are like both. So there is insurance available for seismic hazard and for wildfires as well, but they tend to not be provided by one single supplier like the flood insurance. A very nice thing with the flood insurance is that data is available. And for this work, I'm using almost the entire universe of observations on flood insurance transactions, because the flood insurance is provided by the federal government by more than like 95%. In contrast, when you look at seismic hazard or even wildfires, a lot of these insurance products are provided by private firms. So it's much, much harder to get the data. If you know someone that has access to these companies or who has access to this data, I'd love to chat with them and do some work on this, because a lot of really important questions are occurring in these markets. And just to say a couple of words on wildfire risk, in the last couple of years, there are a few private insurance companies in California that decided to stop insuring homes for wildfire because potential losses were becoming too great. So these private insurance companies are exiting the market, which means that either there is no more wildfire insurance available to the homes that are still there, or the wildfire insurance is becoming a lot more expensive. And again, it's not necessarily a bad thing in itself, because you want climate change and climate risk to somehow be capitalized in insurance products and housing values, because that way we hope that people are going to make better decisions about where to live, and in particular decide to not live in places that are so prone to flood risk or to wildfire risk. But at the same time, a lot of people have been living there for a very long time, and it's very costly for them to move elsewhere. And so if they didn't know that there was such high flood risk or wildfire risk, when insurance companies decide to pull out of this market, it means that they may be unable to pay flood insurance in the first place. So yeah, a lot of really cool questions could be asked for all these insurance markets.
Well, Joel, thank you for such a wonderful workshop today and sort of providing all this information. And I'll say thank you to all of the attendees for attending today's sessions and the questions and the conversation that happened afterwards. And you can follow up with any additional questions in the Slack channel. I know Liz posted that earlier in the Slack, so Joe can also go in there and help follow up on some of the questions as well. And he's provided his email address, so you can reach out to him as well. So again, thank you. And this concludes the workshop. And we'll see you all online tomorrow starting at 11 a.m. and the links are on the website. So again, thank you all, and everything can carry over onto the Slack channel for further conversation. So thank you, Joe.
Great. Thank you, Amy.